Magandang umaga, magandang tanghali, magandang hapon at magandang gabi. Yan po ang ating bukang salita tuwing tayo ay magsisimula ng ating programang Rita Gadi Hour, which is actually your hour. At yung pagbati na yan ay tinuro sa atin ng unang ginang natin, yung pa rin ang tawag ko sa kanya, unang ginang Imelda Romualdez Marcos. Sabi nga niya, of all the languages of the world, we always say good evening, good morning, etc., buongiorno, and all of this. But or we in German we say guten Morgen and so forth. But it is always the good that comes ahead of the greeting in the time of day. But in our language, Tagalog, it is beautiful. That is the word that's being used. Maganda. And that's exactly why it is more pleasant to say it in such a manner. Kaya inuulit-ulit ko yan sapagkat sabi nga ni Mrs. Marcos, simulan mo yung palatuntunan na nagsasabi kang maganda ang umaga, ang tanghali, ang hapon at ang gabi. And that is exactly how we should approach life in many ways. It has to be a beautiful world that we see, and the beauty is also coming from within us. As they say, beauty is truth, truth is beauty, and whatever else you would go as far as definitions are concerned. Well, September is an important month as far as my memory goes. And sometimes we tend to forget and to edit many of the things that have happened in the past. But isn't that always the case? We remember the good times, the good deeds. But of course, what is painful and what is sorrowful, we carry that likewise in the silence of our tears, in the grief that we have in many ways. But that now is not the time to think about sad things. Now is the time to commemorate many things for the month of September. However else you would look at it. We just had the anniversary of Ferdinand Edralin Marcos' birth 103 years ago. If he continued to live after his death in Hawaii when he was how old at the time? Only 72 or thereabouts, 78. I don't really have the exact date, but then he would have been 103 years old on September 11. Today, there would also be other commemorations of birthdays. Well, his son, Ferdinand Marcos II, also celebrates a birthday on September 13. And then, of course, we have September 21, which is the Declaration of Martial Law, a very important declaration which brought about the change of our Republic of the Philippines into a new society, because that was the intent and the goal of the Declaration of Martial Law, the creation of a new society, a new beginning, a new approach to the way things are, discarding the old habits and the bad habits of the past. And then you have September 28, which is the death anniversary also of Ferdinand Edralin Marcos. So you could see that September is a month, not just something, but a month which is important as far as my memory goes. Many times we have talked about in snippets things that happened how long ago? Maybe 50 years ago, from 1966 to 1986, that's almost close to 21 years. And then you had from 1986 up to the present, which is about 35 years. But every time we are able to have the opportunity to talk about that period prior to 1986, we come about to just snippets because there is so much to talk about. And the reality is, we have never had the opportunity to really talk about it. In the 35 years of the past, it is very seldom, if at all, that I personally have been invited to any radio program or to any television program to talk about the Marcoses. They avoided anyone to talk about the Marcoses, and knowing that I covered the Marcoses during their administration, and yet they would not want to hear about it because they have done everything, not just to demonize the Marcoses, but to destroy whatever else the Marcoses have built and have set about as the platform and the fundamentals of the governance that we ought to have continued until this time, but did not, precisely because there was this revolutionary change, if you would call it that, for the messy kind of world that we are experiencing today. Anyway, so what is important is that we are given this opportunity through this Katipunan ng Demokratikong Pilipino channel. What is this channel? This is an organization which was set up, a political organization with a platform and also based on principles, and also part of the movement that was earlier organized called the Save the Nation movement, which contains all the different concerns that we as a people should take into consideration and should be able to stand up for, so that we can really have the change that is necessary. This was established by some of the finest minds that we have this part of the planet, and of course some of the finest experiences that also went into it. We have Sir Butch Valdez, who started all of this Save the Nation movement, and then we have our colleagues in the Katipunan and Demokratikong Pilipino rallying actually with the cry of the first revolution of the Philippines from the 1896, and then we have their R.J. Javellana, who has spoken of so many of the important concerns and all of those that must be undertaken already several decades ago. And that's the thing that he has actually been shouting his throat dry, as a matter of fact, in every opportunity to talk for the people, to talk for the consumers, to talk for those who use the basic services which are now in the hands of the oligarchs. That's R.J. Javellana. And then you have one of the finest minds also in the information technology, Toti Casino, Dr. Toti Casino. And he has also spoken about what we are entering now, the digital world, the world of information technology, and how all of this should have already been undertaken several decades ago, so that we will now be entering this new horizon, which could be easier for us as far as work from home is concerned, and all the different concerns that we have to be connected with the rest of the world, precisely because of this information technology program. We are a little behind and a little late as far as this, but it continues to teach us and to let us know how valuable information technology is in our day-to-day lives, especially now that we're undergoing this pandemic. This pandemic has brought us to many realizations, but what I would want to emphasize is the fact that after so many years, 35 years, that there was never an opportunity to speak about what happened 21 years of the Marcos administration. Social networking, as we said, information technology, the internet, YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, all of these different postings and accounts has given us, they all have given us rather, that particular avenue and the highway by which we could follow through and be able to talk about things which we were never able to talk about. In fact, one columnist even said, Bobby Dicla was saying, there's not been anyone really who has talked about the Marcos time so far. Sad, because those who would want to talk are not given the chance to talk. Those that know what happened then are also hesitant to do this, precisely because of the many things that they had to go through just to be able to stand as somebody who recognizes what has been done during the time of President Marcos. So when I keep going back to that time, it is necessary and it is important. It is also for our own benefit that we come to realize that history has a purpose for being there. And when they say that whenever you speak about the Marcoses, it is revising history. If you speak of something good as far as what they have done, my dear listeners and viewers, it is not a revision of history. It is actually the telling of the truth. Because truth is very easy to tell, and it is only evil that complicates. And see what happened when truth has been kept quiet for the past 35 years, perhaps in its own way, in our little way, because of this hour that is provided us by the Katipunan and Demokratikong Pilipino. We can speak of the concerns of how we can save the nation by being able to gather from the big load of the past the things that should have been continued, the things that we can still do at this present stage, and many of the concerns that we can follow through, especially now that we have the opportunity to do so, with the President who has undertaken as best as he could many of the things that really ought to be done, especially now that we have this pandemic, a national health program taking into consideration all the different sectors involved in this program, including the health workers, the economists, the financiers, all of those small and medium and micro industries and enterprises, and everybody else, extending this as far as the law is concerned with this Bayanihan Act, where the President has already distributed as much as several millions, actually, I don't have the exact number, but this is several hundred millions to 18 million of those that are in need of assistance. Then we have now the Bayanihan Act 2, which has just recently signed, and which will also become the law that will provide assistance for the small, medium, micro, mini businesses and industries and enterprises that form about 75 or 80% of our informal economy. And that is what would keep us going, because what is important at this stage precisely is food on the table, sustenance, jobs that will still have to be created. But other than jobs that will be created, what else can we do as far as seeking livelihood programs are concerned on a day-to-day basis, so that we do not go hungry, and that we are able to have the proper nutrition. All of this, as we've said, are part of these discussions that are usually being done on television, on radio, but every once in a while it is also important to go back in time and find out exactly what has happened then that we could still utilize at this particular stage. Now that there are so many discussions about vaccines that are coming and so forth, where is all of this coming from really? So then we will find out that sometime in the past, we did establish in that beginning in the 70s, diplomatic relations with the big countries now that are extending their assistance as far as the possibility of giving us vaccines in case this is already tested after several periods, that it could be utilized now for general application. But be that as it may, let us begin by saying that when we speak of the time of Ferdinand and Imelda Marcos, it is only because we have to tell what has happened then, because that was the truth. And everything I say is based on public documents and public records. I say this because I have covered that period and that particular era in a way that up close and personal, or up close and professional, seeing how President Marcos and Imelda Marcos have really worked on a day-to-day basis to make the Filipino the center of all programs and all of the policies that were undertaken during that time. As a matter of fact, we have to look back again precisely because at this stage we have problems in the South China Sea, we have problems as far as investments are concerned, and all of this could be able to be straightened out if we only take lessons learned from that particular period. So from the beginning, where does it all actually come from? Well, in February 1986, we had the presidential elections. That was not the scheduled national elections according to our constitution. That was called for, or forced to be called for, by the workings of the Washington bureaucracy, because they were afraid that should anything happen to Marcos, because what they felt was his deteriorating health, that their bases would be affected. You have two of the largest American bases here in our country at that time, which was part of a mutual defense treaty signed sometime in the 1950s. You had the Air Force base in Clark, and then you have the naval base in Subic. And they were worried at the time. There were other bases throughout the country where they also occupied, but these are the two largest outside of the mainland of America. And they were a little apprehensive regarding this. Plus, of course, the fact that they were not sure where Marcos was going as far as its, how would you call this? As far as the, what people would say that he was a puppet of America. So as far as the dictates of Washington are concerned, they were a little bit worry about this. Despite the fact that there was the perception of those opposing President Marcos, plus all these activists and militants with all the banners they were raising, what would they write there in the walls and in all their placards? Tuta ng Amerikano. They would say Marcos is a puppet of America. They gave the perception that Marcos would follow anything that America wants. But here is the truth. When Marcos was proclaimed President of the Republic of the Philippines after the elections for the presidency in 1965, so he had his first term in the year 1966. He was immediately, perhaps just a few months after he sat into office as Commander-in-Chief and Chief Executive of the Republic of the Philippines, he was invited for a state visit to the United States of America, where he would be able to address, and that was exactly what was programmed, the Joint House of the American Congress. At that time, simultaneous to that elections here in the Philippines, there was a war waging in Vietnam. That was the Vietnam War. To many of you who were not born at the time, you may think that this is already part of ancient history. Well, that was one of the longest wars here in our part of Asia. That was the North and South Vietnam. The North was supported by the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, the Soviets, the Communist Russia as you would call it today. And the other half, which is South Vietnam, was supported by the United States of America. So it was, in effect, a very real surrogate war between two world powers at the time, communism and democracy. So they were, America was really lining up its allies, especially here in Asia, to fight in the Vietnam War together with them. Russia did not have to have any allies because it's one of the biggest countries. It had all the Soviet republics at the time. But it was America that needed the support of its allies here in Asia so that it could go to war and say to the world that, you see, we are here fighting for the preservation of democracy in this little country of Vietnam. So they invited Marcos so that Marcos would address Congress in America and declare that he would be joining his, how do you call this, brother America in the war in Vietnam. And Marcos spoke spontaneously without any document. His speech was not written down that he could read. There were no teleprompters yet that were installed at the time, or perhaps it was not yet in place even at the time. And he spoke spontaneously, talking about the relationship our country has with America, and of course the repetition of that line, America does not forget, meaning that America will always stand by its allies and will not forget, of course, the benefits that ought to be given to our soldiers here in the Philippines who fought side by side with America when we were invaded by Japan, which is an enemy of America, together with the simultaneous bombing of Pearl Harbor and of Manila. But be that as it may, that was the speech of President Marcos. Not one line at all was mentioned as far as the Vietnam War was concerned. And that really made Washington bureaucracy very uncomfortable. And so what happened? Prior to that, Marcos was an Imelda, where covers of all the leading magazines and newspapers in America, in the Western media. Marcos was the staunch ally of democracy of the United States of America, the most decorated war hero, etc. All the praises and accolades given to him on front pages and covers of magazines, Time, Life, Newsweek, all of this. Plus, Imelda also was also featured as the most beautiful and the most brilliant and the most active, etc., of all the first ladies in the world. And they were really glorified in many ways, just so as there would be that acceptance that here is a staunch defender of democracy here in Southeast Asia who would be joining America in the Vietnam War. Marcos instead told Washington, I will be sending my soldiers, but they will be non-combatant. They will help in infrastructure, in medical services, and whatever else is needed, but they are not going to carry any guns, and we are not going to fight together with you to shoot the Vietnamese. Vietnam is a neighbor, barely 5 hours away from our country, and I cannot dare fight a neighbor. And that was how America, or at least the Washington bureaucracy, felt very uncomfortable. So when you say that all the opposition was right when they say puppet of America, it is not true, because that was the first few months of the Marcos presidency. Next to that, well, the American bases here occupied something like 10,000 or so hectares of land in Subic and in Clark. And Marcos reduced that land coverage to about just a few hundred hectares. From, I think, 100,000 hectares to about 10,000 hectares, I really don't know. But there was a very big reduction of the territory that was occupied. Because sabi nga ni President Marcos, they do not need that much land because all of that could also be devoted to agricultural purposes. Anyway, in addition to that, he also had the Philippine flag fly over this bases, not the American flag. So he had the American flag lowered and the Philippine flag raised because this is Philippine territory and those American soldiers are simply occupying the territory. Plus, we are not going to accept just whatever aid U.S. Congress would want to extend to us. So when they say, we give you this so many hundred millions for aid and we just give you some second-hand ammunitions and material, war material, that is it. Be content with that for the use of those bases. So Marcos said, no, you pay rent the way other people pay rent for the territory they occupy, which does not belong to them. And that can never belong to America because, as you've said, foreigners will have to, will have to go through the Philippine Constitution before they can really own that land anyway. Other than that, of course, America, well, other than many other provisions in the Military Defense Treaty, with the reduction of the time element from 99 years to 25 years, that really made Washington very uncomfortable. So it is not correct to say that he was a puppet of America. They were really quite uncomfortable. They could not let go of him at that time, not yet, because they still needed him to speak gloriously about America, which he did. In the address he delivered the South Lawn of Washington, of the residence of President Reagan, when he made a second state visit, he really glorified America in such a manner. So anyway, that was then, and that is why I say that all of these accusations that Marcos is a puppet of America, it isn't true. And records would indicate that exactly is what has happened as far as the base is concerned, as far as the Vietnam War is concerned. Plus the fact that we were also hesitant to enter the World Trade Organization, organized also by America, because Marcos wanted to protect our own agricultural products instead of relying from all of these imported vegetables, etc., and all of these from other countries. That would be competing with our domestic produce. But by force of, that was what happened, and that happened after Marcos administration. You see what is happening now. Our onions, our garlic, etc., whatever else, and all the canned goods coming in sometimes from all of these manufactured factories outside of our country, imported goods, as a matter of fact, because of this WTO. And of course, we still have the burden of the World Bank and the IMF. But be that as it is, there were many concerns of Washington's bureaucracy where Marcos really veered away from just being an American puppet. Two of the most important diplomatic relations that he opened at the height of the Cold War, while America was waging war in Vietnam and waging its confrontation in many ways and in many parts of the world against the Soviet Union. At the time, it was still the Soviet Union, not yet the People's Republic of China, because China was still battling with its massive cultural revolution and its massive poverty. So it was just the Soviet Union. And that was where America was battling it on all fronts. And you could imagine how, at that particular stage, it was necessary really to have allies. So immediately after that state visit of Marcos, and they were expecting me to announce that we will be supporting America in the Vietnam War, Lyndon Johnson, the president, incumbent president, had called for a summit here in Manila, for the member countries of the CETO. The CETO is the Southeast Asian Treaty Organization. Only 5 member countries here in the region. The way the NATO was, where you have also this treaty organization in Europe, that was what the CETO is here in our region. So what happened was, President Johnson called for the summit together with his allies like New Zealand, Australia, Britain, and whatever it is, to be able to have Marcos again finally declare that we will be joining the war in Vietnam. But President Johnson was treated to many events where he had several opportunities to visit Corregidor, the last bastion of our defense against Japan, from where the Death March actually began and so forth, and several other occasions. But in any event where there were some public press conference and so forth, there was not mention from President Marcos regarding the Vietnam War, which Washington would have wanted him to do. And that was where he said, yes, I will support America in Vietnam, but only with non-combatant soldiers who will help in infrastructure and medical services. And that was it. A reconstruction and so forth. So you could see that even at the time, in the early 60s even, America was already wary and uncomfortable with the way President Marcos was behaving, not according to the way Washington would have wanted or would have dictated him to do, precisely because he was supposed to be the bastion of America's hold here in the Southeast Asian region. And of course, when Marcos opened the diplomatic relations with communist countries, first with the Union of Soviet Socialist Republic, can you imagine that? Mrs. Marcos was sent ahead to open the doors of the Iron Curtain, as Soviet Union was called, and then the state visit of Ferdinand Marcos to a communist country in Moscow, the opening of that diplomatic reward, that really made Washington bureaucracy very, very uncomfortable. And immediately after, we had the opening of diplomatic relations with the People's Republic of China, which was then just concluding the Cultural Revolution. Chairman Mao Zedong was already in retirement. We already had the offices of the leadership in China held by Zhou Enlai and Deng Xiaoping. and shortly thereafter. And President Marcos, again, Mrs. Marcos was sent to pave the way for the opening of these diplomatic relations. We were there 10 days in September, a glorious time as far as diplomatic relations concerned, because we have never had such a beautiful and warm and massive reception as that undertaken by the People's Republic of China when the Philippine Airlines chartered flight landed in Beijing. So there you have, after that, the state visit of President Marcos. Oh my goodness. And then, of course, the acknowledgement by the leadership of the People's Republic of China to President Nixon, who already stepped down from the presidency, and to inform President Nixon how grateful and how admirable and how respected President Richard Nixon was by the Chinese leadership because of his efforts as far as establishing relationship with the People's Republic of China, insulting in a way, or at least, how do you call it, informally, the present leadership in the United States of America. This is geopolitics, and I'm talking about this precisely because we have to emphasize how many of the things that President Marcos did during his embassy were not comfortable with Washington. And when we say that he was tuta ng Amerikano, it is not exactly true. And public records would show this, or would indicate exactly what I'm saying. So prior to that, let's get back to what happened from 1986. Because this is where a lot of things have just, dramatically changed. Marcos won the election, which was called for by the United States of America, the snap elections. They were worried that what they perceived as deteriorating health would be also affecting the American bases here. And since Marcos reduced its timeline from 99 years to 25 years, that treaty would be, the occupancy of this basis would be expiring in 1992. So if Marcos would still not be able to hold fast the preservation of this basis and extend it further than 1992, then they need somebody else. They need another leader. They were thinking of Salvador Laurel, but there was, of course, the other indication that Mrs. Aquino would be a more emotional kind of candidate other than Salvador Laurel, although he was one of the first choices anyway. So that was what happened. A snap elections was maneuvered by Washington bureaucracy, and that was exactly what we had on February 7, 1986. So we had the snap elections. Marcos won in the February 7, 1986 election. He was proclaimed by the National Assembly, which was the parliament at the time, at the Batasang Pambansa, which is what now everybody is using as the halls of Congress, the lower chamber. He was proclaimed, and then he took his office before the Supreme Court Chief Justice, as provided for by our Constitution at the time. Mrs. Aquino did not win the elections. She proclaimed herself the president in Club Filipino and took her oath of office there by one member of the Supreme Court. And then she organized her own cabinet and had her friends and people that she knew and people of her choice to write a revolutionary constitution. And because of that constitution, that was where she issued executive orders with the power of a law. So you see that she was one of those who can actually be called a dictator, because other than the fact that she was following her own constitution and her own law written by her own people, she also removed all elected local government officials, all governors of 81 provinces, all mayors of cities and municipalities, 1,500 of them, all of the provincial and municipal and city boards. She removed also the judiciary from their offices, the Supreme Court, the Court of Appeals, and several others in several courts. Likewise, anybody at all, directly, indirectly, or even perceived to be the whiff of the relationship with Ferdinand E. Marcos, all of them were removed from office. And then she executed and signed the first executive order, together with executive order number 1, number 2, number 12, number 12A, declaring that since Marcos stole the money of the Filipino people, remember, that was already declared as a law without even due process or any trial, declaring that anything associated with anybody, the family, relatives, friends, and associates, and all other properties that these people held associated with Marcos are declared to be ill-got as stolen wealth from the Filipino people. Mahaba yung, the provisions of this executive orders are rather long, but that created what we now know as the infamous Presidential Commission on Good Government. We had the power and the right to sequester, to sell, to do anything they wish with any property, real or otherwise, associated with any of those, anybody associated with the Marcoses. So even the toys of your children, if you're associated with him, anything that you have in your possession could be the subject of a court case, because that is alleged, not even alleged, that is declared rather as stolen from the Filipino people. Oh my goodness, that was Mrs. Aquino's first executive order, a law. And the head of that PCGG was Jovito Salonga. I just have to add to this because there is a claim that because of Senate at the time, after Jovito Salonga resigned from the PCGG and he entered Senate, that he, together with several senators, were responsible for the American bases getting out of our country. No, the bases actually expired. Their timeline expired in 1992 because Marcos said that they can only stay for 25 years. And since there was no longer the time for review, then the Senate at the time under Mrs. Aquino did no longer renew the extension. So it was not because the senators then of Mrs. Aquino and Jovito Salonga were the ones who removed the American bases. No, it was Marcos early on during his term that actually reduced the 99 years occupancy to 25 years, which was to expire in 1992, which is already the time of Mrs. Aquino at that particular stage anyway. So I just had to mention that in passing because a lot of people are claiming that they were the ones who removed the Americans here because of what Marcos did during his regime. Anyway, so as he said, here you have the infamous PCGG. Oh my goodness, what did they do? They started sequestering but practically whatever it is that they perceived to be associated with Marcos. But many of those associated with President Marcos entered into compromise agreements with Salonga, who was then the chairman of the PCGG. These compromise agreements are all on file. When I speak here, as I said, I am backed up by documents and public records. They're all on file with the PCGG, which is still in existence up to this day. You have the compromise agreement. For a certain amount that they paid to the office of Jovito Salonga, they liberated themselves from any court case, just in case the Aquino government would want to file cases against them. And they cherry-picked. So whatever properties they held for President Marcos, if at all that they actually admitted this, they just admitted it belonged to them. And the rest, they could turn over to the Philippine government. And that was what the first act of the PCGG was, entering into these compromise agreements with the so-called, that is the term used, cronies. They were not cronies, my dear listeners. They were nominees. Nominees in the sense that you couldn't place the name of Ferdinand Marcos in many of these private corporations because he was President of the Republic. But because of his investments, his personal investments in many of these corporations and businesses which were terminated because of the Laurel-Langley Act which expired in 1974, who was to take over with all of these American enterprises, like the telephone company, the electric company, some of the manufacturing corporations. Many of these were owned privately by American citizens. But because that ownership was terminated because of the agreement between America and the Philippines with the Laurel-Langley Act, that was when parity rights, meaning Americans had equal rights as Filipinos, that ended in 1974 and was no longer extended. And since they were no longer extended, all of these big companies were taken over by private funds so that they could continue operating electricity, water, electrical connections, water, Meralco, what is the, yes, all of this actually, we even have this Philippine Gas Corporation that was originally also held by the Americans, our telephone companies and so forth. All of that was taken over by private funds of President Marcos and held by his nominees, not cronies in the sense that they invested there, but it was the money that was put there. They held it in trust for President Marcos because that was his money that went into all of this corporations, etc. But eventually, as I've said, the government took over public services because these are public utilities which the government should take over. So that ought to be clear as far as that particular period is concerned. Going back then to what we say as the accusation that Marcos stole the money of the Filipino people, I think that was already determined quite clearly, and really quite clearly, after 4 months of a trial that went on in New York City, because the Philippine government under Mrs. Aquino did not want to file criminal charges against Marcos here in his own country, in our country, in the Philippines. They did not want him to return home. They violated again a very important human rights provision in any constitution throughout the world, and in the Philippine Constitution, that a person will have to be present at the trial of any criminal case filed against him. So they did not want to file any criminal case against Ferdinand E. Marcos here in our country so that he will not return to face his accusers. So what they did, in collaboration with the Justice Department of the United States of America, because of the deal, hopefully that the basis would be extended. Remember, these cases were filed in 86 rather, March 1986. So the bases were still here and will expire only in 1992. So there was the hope, but by accommodating the request of the Philippine government of Mrs. Aquino to file criminal cases against Marcos in America, then there could be a deal that Mrs. Aquino will extend the basis 1992 upwards. That was the deal, and that was testified upon by the last witness of the Justice Department of the United States of America in the court. He took the witness stand. He was one of the last, if not the last. Timothy Can, I remember his name. He was the last of those that delivered his testimony by the prosecution, by the Justice Department of the United States of America. And what did he say? Because when he was asked, why are you in this courtroom? Why are you testifying against Mrs. Marcos, against Ferdinand Marcos? You know what he answered? Because I was told, no case against Marcos, no deal with the basis. No indictment and no conviction, no basis. In other words, they wanted to convict Imelda because at the time, Marcos was already dead. He died in 1989 in Hawaii. But again, there was that bargaining for the basis. So no conviction of Imelda, no basis. So it was important that Imelda would be convicted, so that was the deal. Cory would extend, or at least Cory and her tribe would extend the U.S. bases here beyond 1992. That was the deal testified on by the witness of the Justice Department of America against the Marcoses. Timothy Can is his name. You could look at it. 6,000 pages of the court records. You could read it there. You could buy it if you want to. That's about $1 a page. And then you could read there the last testimony of this Timothy Can when he said, no conviction, no basis. My goodness. So that is how, as I said, this is not just telling a story. I am not revising history. I am telling what the truth is as it is there on the records, publicly and officially. Okay, so you have the PCG. Let's get back to the PCG. I wrote this I had to write this. So based on the executive orders of 1, 2, 12, and 12A, creating the Philippine Commission on Good Government, or the PCGG, that gave Mrs. Aquino the authority to get, I do not want to use the word steal, but to sequester the Marcos wealth and all of those associated with him. Firstly, they got everything from the personal closets and private vaults of the Marcoses inside Malacanang. Remember, this was the private residence of the chief executive. They went in, they took everything out without any warrant or any court record or any warrant from the court. They just went in and took everything. And it is not even officials of Aquino's government that came in and took over. You only had in the beginning, not in the beginning, in the first hour, that was about 9 o'clock in the evening. The Marcoses left at about 7:30. At about 9 o'clock in the evening, you had Joker Arroyo and his aide, Potenciano Roque, enter Malacanang. And then Roque gave instructions to Potenciano Roque to look over what was happening. And then this is the testimony that was also done by Potenciano Roque. That's why I can talk about it. He testified also in the trial in New York. He described Malacanang at the time. He said that the chafing dishes were still warm, and there was, everything was, the boxes and whatever it is was all around. He opened a safe in, I don't know if it's a filing cabinet, but the combination to the safe was pasted on the door of the safe, so he was able to open this. He found a bag of diamonds, and he said he took this and gave it to Mrs. Aquino. Then he picked a number of documents which he thought perhaps would be necessary, interesting, and that was it. So you had a private individual, Potenciano Roque, entering the private chambers of those who occupied it decently and properly and officially as the private residence of Ferdinand and Imelda Marcos. The following morning, you had not government officials again. You had friends of Mrs. Aquino, mga kamadyong niya. You had, I don't want to mention so many of their names. You had friends, these ladies anyway. But one lady was already coming down from Malacanang when these three other ladies went in, and she was carrying some bags, Louis Vuitton bags with them. And when one of the ladies testified in court just to describe when they went in and what they got inside, this is Mrs. Trinidad. I have to mention her name because she was the one who testified in New York. Her statements are court records, official court records, and she said she already saw Ting Cojuangco, an in-law of Mrs. Aquino, coming down with bags. And when she was asked what was inside those bags, and she answered, non-documents. You tried to conclude what they were anyway. So these three ladies, according to Mrs. Trinidad, as she was testifying in New York, they went over cabinets, drawers, etc., and were looking over documents. And that was when they put all of this in big bags, in what do you call this, maletas, suitcases, Louis Vuitton suitcases that were left there, boxes likewise. They did not have an inventory. They did not have a pad paper writing down what they were putting in these boxes. They just looked over documents. They saw the purchases of several equipment, exercise equipment for Amy Marcos or whatever it is. Kasi may mga resibo. They took it. They saw whatever documents they felt that they think would be used against the Marcoses, because these were private personal documents, remember. So they put it all in boxes, and they brought all of this to the house of this Mrs. Trinidad, where Mrs. Aquino, Fidel Castro, Juan Ponce Enrile, and several other of the new administration of Mrs. Aquino went over these documents, which eventually they said they kept in the central bank, but which documents eventually were turned over to the United States government to be used in the trial of New York. That is why I said many of these were marked. So if it's from the palace, it's P, and then the number. P means palace, meaning that was how they called Malacanang at the time. And then you had, for instance, H, which was the indicator that the documents were taken from Hawaii. Because remember, President and Mrs. Marcos were also able to bring some of their personal documents. But as soon as they landed at Hicam Air Base, it was all confiscated, taken away from them. So not one document was left with the Marcoses. So if it's from Hawaii, then it was H. And then there were other indicators, if it came from the bank, etc. Well, there are also letters and numbers to prove where these documents were taken. All 350,000 documents. As I keep on repeating, that's exactly the number of paper documents that was there in one whole room at the Dag Hammarskjöld Towers, which was used, as I've said, against the Marcoses. And, well, I described this already. Whenever the Justice Department prosecutor, who was Charles Labella, whenever he entered the courtroom, normally you would have the lawyers carrying their attaché case or somebody carrying an attaché case for them. But the prosecution against Mrs. Marcos entered the courtroom with a grocery cart, the one that we use when we go shopping in the grocery. That was how much, what adverb will I use? How the number of documents that they used in a day's trial. Ganun kadami yung mga dokumento na ginamit nila. Nasa loob ng grocery shopping cart. Anyway, so that's the PCGG. But other than that, what else did they take? Well, all the pieces of clothing, the shoes, the underwear, of course, all the other items of value, jewelry, and whatever it is, all of these were obtained, never returned. Not even the private, clothes and underwear, etc. Many of them still unused. They were never returned, even after the acquittal of Mrs. Marcos in New York, that criminal case in New York. So you have there, for instance, they also got, antiques, valuable antiques, the Russian silver collection, the priceless gifts given to them by heads of state whenever they would come to the country or whenever there were state visits, the works of art such as paintings of the Renaissance and pre-Renaissance already exhibited in our museum, Philippine Museum and the Metropolitan Museum. Painting, sculpture, and a whole library of rare and expensive first edition books there in Malacanang, and anything else that they could hold on, all within the private chambers. They got everything from the Marcos residences in San Juan, from the Romualdez residences in Tacloban. They in the personal home, the family home of Marcos in San Juan, for instance. My goodness, you cannot imagine how they ravaged that place. They removed even the doorknobs, the hardwood flooring, the chandeliers, the cabinet doors, anything that could be detached or anything that could be ripped off. They took it out. All the the ceramics, the tiles, because these were beautiful tiles, actually Madoka tiles. They removed all of that. The only thing they got the pianos. There were pianos there in the Marcos residence. I'm already screaming because it hurts. But the only thing they couldn't bring out was the long 24-seating dining table, because they couldn't find a place where they could take it out. So that was the only thing left there. Everything else was taken out. And then, of course, let's go to later, for instance. You had all the precious objects that were there in the Santo Niño Shrine, the whole library of books there in the library, the People's Library that Imelda built. It is located there in Tacloban City. They even dug up the graves of the family of Imelda Romualdez, from her grandparents, her parents, her unborn child, because she had a miscarriage, and her brothers and sisters. They dug up the graves looking for the possibility that there could be gold that would be kept there, and left the bones unburied. They just dug it up, looked for gold, and left the remains of the family of Imelda Romualdez above ground. And when Mrs. Marcos returned in 1991, the first thing that she did was to fly to Tacloban to rebury the bones of her ancestors, her mother, her father, brothers and sisters, and all the rest of her family. That was the PCGG. And the house there in Olot, her hometown, which is outside of Tacloban City, was completely ravaged. Almost not one pillar was left. Everything else was taken. The roof, the ceiling, the flooring, the cabinets, everything. The silverware, the plates, all was taken away. And then, of course, you have all of this. I already said it. I'm reading this from what I wrote. The desecration of this was actually published in a way, but just in the inside pages, and there were not many photographs of how horrendous that digging was actually. Then, of course, I already mentioned the exhibits of the paintings. These are foreign paintings by Renaissance and pre-Renaissance painters in the Metropolitan Museum in the Central Bank of the Philippines. And of course, I already mentioned the entire silver collection, all of this. And then they were auctioned off for the cheapest price that you can imagine. Christie's, I still have the books here already regarding this sale that they did. And then, of course, also several of the real estate. When Imelda won the case in New York, the buildings there that were bought by their private money were taken over by the government, and the government sold this. I think it was the GSIS chairman at the time, what's his name, Belmonte, who actually took over the selling of these buildings, together with one building in Union Square in San Francisco. Those of you who would know how important Union Square is as far as the commercial business economy of San Francisco is. And we had one building there, the Philippine Airlines, the Philippine Consulate, that was sold. Why? It's not even the money of the Filipino people that bought it, but it was used for the purpose of the Philippine government. Anyway, that was done and sold under the GSIS chairmanship of, I think, Feliciano Belmonte at the time, during the Cory administration, and several others. Oh my goodness, and several of their personal personal luggage, personal belongings, they were all taken, including some documents that were there in a what they call in a duffel bag, which President Marcos is looking for, because that was the duffel bag, I think, where he had several gold certificates or whatever. It was never returned to him, and it got lost somewhere in the confiscation that they did at the Hicam Air Base. Oh my goodness. And so many others. It's, if you could look at it, well, I will just show it briefly. This is a whole page here. So you could see that these are all the items. I have really written it down, itemized it. And these are all public records, because these are all part of the testimonies, part of the evidences that they presented in New York. So I am not reading this or relaying this to you as coming from what I thought or perceived to be. It is actually written down as what is recorded from what was taken from the pallet, from Malacanang, from the airport in Hicam when the Marcoses arrived there, from their what they confiscated in their residences there, and of course in several other places where they found several documents in the place in the residence of Aimee, etc., and all of this anyway. So yeah, there you have the Philippine government under Cory, and they filed something like 986 cases, civil and criminal cases, against Imelda Marcos as soon as she arrived. So you can imagine she had more cases than the number of days in a year. We only have how many days in a year, but she had 986, and so she had to attend to all of this. Ang dami pa niyan, so many more that I could talk about, but I have not even touched, I've only scratched the surface. I've not even touched many of the more important things that were done at that time. But this is where you could see that if they could do this to a chief executive, such as President Marcos at that time, to destroy everything that he has done, and to destroy the memory of what he has done, to expunge his name in all of this constructions and buildings. You can imagine what they have done to the country as a whole. And I will go through that as the days and our hour proceeds in another program, because as I've said, I've only scratched the beginning of that particular administration, which, if we have the continuance unto this day, it would probably take us several volumes actually to just talk about the ignominy that has been done. Why is this being done? In our own small measure, we are able to talk about it with the hope that by telling the story of what happened then, we can be able to reveal the truth, and that is exactly what we keep on repeating. The truth is very easy to tell, the way I'm doing it right now. It is only evil that complicates. So you could see what has happened before the truth is able to be revealed. Well, so that it goes. This is your hour, and I'd like to thank you for having joined us. This is Rita Gadi.